In this episode, I'm going to be talking about how to create compelling depth inside of your mixes. If you don't know me, my name is Tyson. I've been mixing and mastering for over 13 years. And in the last episode and this episode, I've been talking about how to create changes in how you view your mixes to be able to then create more compelling and professional mixes. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the 5 phases in your mix to then be able to create compelling depth inside of your mix to get that nice rich landscape that you want out of your mixes versus, so let's dive in. The first thing I need to cover is the idea of depth is actually just all psychoacoustics. What I mean by that is that there are 2 speakers producing your mix, and they are about 3 feet away from you in a normal mixing environment most of the time. And in reality, the entire mix is only 3 feet away from you. So we need to basically utilize what exists in real life to be able to imitate some sort of depth or distance inside of our mix to then be able to create this contrast between the things that are close and things that are far away in order for something to appear to have depth, right? Because it's in reality, nothing has depth in a mix, but we need to create depth in the mix psychoacoustically. This kind of opens up the world of there are 4 ways to create depth, which we're going to be covering here in the 5 phases to create depth in your mix. But before I do that, I want to nail this idea of contrast home with you before we dive into that. So when I was a kid, I thought my dad was really tall, and it was great, right? You know, I wanted to be big and strong and tall like dad was. And then at a certain point, I realized that my dad really wasn't very tall. He was only 5'6". And so comparatively to most of the other men that I saw walking around in the big wide world, my dad was actually pretty short. And so it shifted my perception of what was tall. Because before, my only comparison was myself. And obviously, as a 4 or 5-year-old boy, I was not very tall. And so my dad was the easiest comparison that I had for somebody who was really tall. And so this is the idea, though, is that we need to create this contrast because to be able to create this feeling of depth inside of our mixes, because if I have, let's just say a snare, and the snare is the front of my mix, I want that to be the thing that feels the closest to me. And then I'm going to be able to create this feeling of depth with all the other elements inside of the mix because they're going to be all sitting behind the snare inside of the mix. Even if the snare is not very loud, if I have something else that's really quiet that sounds really far away in my mix, the snare is going to feel bigger than it actually is. So this is the secret to depth, and also the secret to a lot of mixing and how to make your mix feel larger than life is this comparison idea. Because if we have everything in our volume balance, let's say, at an equal power in the mix, then we're not actually going to be able to create this sense of depth because everything will feel close and therefore nothing will actually feel close. It'll just feel flat. So while you'll be able to hear everything in your mix, it won't actually be compelling. Let's talk about depth. How do we actually create this depth in the mix? The first thing that I needed to cover is the 3 parts of depth. The 3 parts of depth is really just the spaces that exist inside of your mix. This is how I like to view it. It makes it really easy to dial this in with all of these 5 phases that I'm going to cover here in a second. The first space is just the front space, the middle space, and the back space. By thinking of your mix in these 3 spaces, it just makes your mix incredibly easy to set up, incredibly easy to execute, and also to keep in mind, have this helpful frame for the duration of the mix. Okay, so let's dive in on the first phase on how to create depth in your mix. The first phase is volume. So this is the first thing what we do inside of our mix. We load up our tracks, we gain stage a little bit, and now we're diving into the volume balance, or the static mix if you prefer, though, that term. The volume balance is really tricky because most people want to be able to hear everything inside of the volume balance because it's so critical to get this right, which that is correct. But the problem is they want to hear everything inside of the mix. That's a mistake. If we're able to hear everything, that means that everything is relatively in equal volume in the mix. Because remember, we haven't EQ'd yet. We haven't compressed yet. We haven't done any relational EQ. We haven't done any reverb or effects. A lot of our elements are going to be hidden in the volume balance because those other processes are working on creating that separation, kind of stretching the mix wide, deep, and just creating frequency balance and space for every element to exist. So we're reducing masking, we're reducing issues with dynamic processing that are potentially covering up other elements, things like that. So the volume balance, if you can hear everything in your mix, assuming we have a relatively dense mix, right? There's more than 10 tracks. If you can hear everything distinctly inside of the mix, you likely don't have depth in your mix. And therefore, it's going to be really, really hard to set up later in the mix. I've already used up our biggest lever and haven't actually utilized our biggest lever to be able to create depth inside of the mix. So when I'm doing the volume balance, I'm going to be thinking of those three spaces. So the front, middle, and back. I'm going to bring up those front elements first. So that's going to be the kick and the snare, maybe the vocal. And then I'm going to be setting up the next space in the mix, which is the middle space. I'm going to bring up all those other elements. Let's say it's a rock mix. And so I have a guitar, I have a bass, I have some toms, some cymbals, some hi-hats, things like that. And then I have the back space, which is going to be covered up with mostly any pads that I have in the mix, maybe some ear candy, lead guitar stuff, or anything else that's not really critical inside of the mix. And sometimes there won't be any elements in the back space at either points in the song or at all. And we're going to be covering how to actually fix that issue in a later phase. So after we have our volume balance set up and have already had this inkling of depth inside of our mix, it's time to move on to the next phase, which is tonal EQ. Tonal EQ has two main goals inside of our mix. It's to fix the tone of each individual element and accentuate what's great about them and hide what's not necessarily great about them as individual elements. And then also, we're trying to create a better sonic balance overall. This is not related to relative EQ, which is focused on masking. So we're not focused on, if the lead guitar is covering up the vocal and vice versa. We're focused on creating an overall good distribution of all the frequencies inside of our mix. So we want an equal representation of all the different frequencies that we can hear inside of our mix to be able to create a compelling and full sounding mix. Because if there's just one random frequency that's missing, our mix is going to sound a little funky. Tonal EQ is the biggest tool to be able to start fixing those types of issues inside of our mix. The key when it comes to depth is now that we have these three spaces in mind, right? I've kind of mentally or physically maybe tagged each of those elements into one of those three spaces inside of the mix, whether that's the front, the middle, or the back. With our tonal EQ, I'm going to be intentional about creating perception of distance or closeness with EQ. How you do that is just more or less top end brightness to the track. Another way is the 3 kilohertz range is kind of the magic presence or focus inside of the frequency spectrum, because that is actually technically the loudest part of the frequency spectrum that we perceive as humans. And so by turning up the 3 kilohertz range, it has a perception of closeness of presence that otherwise doesn't exist. But when we're looking at actual acoustics, the top end, so anything 10 kilohertz plus, is really what's determinant of closeness, because things that have those high frequencies, they move really, really fast, and therefore they run into a lot of other particles and then they die off very quickly. So if you've ever heard a train that's really far away, you can hear the low rumble of the tracks. You can hear the kind of the beefy low end of the horn, but you can't hear that really shrill part of the horn or the clickety clankety necessarily when it's really far away. And that's because those top end frequencies, they die off, they hit trees and they just hit other air particles and die off very quickly, versus those low frequencies, they tend to travel through space really far and can travel miles because they just run through walls, they run through trees. It doesn't really matter. It's very difficult to stop those waves. So with this in mind, it's very easy to be able to create a perception of distance or closeness with EQ. All we're doing is those items that are in the front, I'm going to be intentional to make sure they're bright enough. If they're already bright, then I may not need to add anything more to it, but that's going to be a question of should I add more or less brightness to this element? Things that are far away, if they have a lot of brightness to them, I'm probably going to back that off a little bit just to be able to make them feel a little bit further away. If you're struggling to get that industry standard quality for your mixes, then go ahead and check out my book, The Objective Mix. It teaches you the objective standards of how to get an industry standard quality mix. There's a link in the description if you are interested in that. Let's get back to the video. Third phase of depth inside of our mix is compression. So compression is the least powerful tool that we have to be able to create depth inside of our mix, but it should not be ignored entirely. So I have a 5-step process for processing dynamics in the mix, which I'm going to be covering in a future episode. But for the purposes of this episode, there are 3 main stages of compression that I create for a mix. I have consistency compression, which just makes the track overall more consistent note to note. Then I have thickness compression, which is then making those signals thicker, as the name would imply. This is actually the lever to make things feel further away. But we don't want to sacrifice some of those other elements, such as our vocals, because our vocals should be pretty thick inside of our mix to be able to keep them present and upfront inside of the mix. We utilize this thickness compression to be able to make our vocal thicker, but we don't want to sacrifice this closeness, which is why the last style of compression comes into play, which is punchy or groovy style compression. Anything with a long attack, essentially. And if you're not familiar with these styles of compression, there's a link down in the description of this video, a video that I did on the 4 styles of compression and how to dial those in. So you can go and access that if you're interested in learning these styles of compression. But groovy or punchy style compression is characterized by a long attack. That's the key, right? So we're allowing that transient of the note, the first part of the note, to pass through without being compressed. So that actually is basically enhanced inside of that track, whatever that is. So let's using our vocal as an example, right? It's going to allow those initial consonants to slip through, and it's going to feel like it's bringing that vocal more intimate, more closer to us. So essentially, we can utilize these styles of compression in serial, so one after another, to be able to then create this sense of both thickness but also closeness. So we're not sacrificing that. But if I'm treating, let's say, a harmony vocal, I'm definitely going to leave at thickness compression, and I'm not going to add that last layer of either punchy or groovy style compression because I don't want to bring that closer. I'm just going to leave it in the back. It's fine if it's thick. If it doesn't have as much dynamics, that's actually better because things that are further away appear to us humans, right, as having less dynamics. We can't distinguish the beginning and ending of the note as much. They kind of start to blend together a little bit. So that's the third phase, is compression. So again, any item that has less dynamics, anything that's thicker, is going to appear to be slightly further away, versus if it has more dynamics, more micro dynamics, so the difference between the beginning and ending of the note, the greater that is, the closer it's going to feel. Let's move on to the fourth phase of dynamics in your mix, the fourth phase of reverb in your mix. I did it again. The fourth phase of depth in your mix, which is reverb, and specifically setting up the reverb depth matrix. So I have another video covering this. So if you want to check that out down below, it'll teach you actually how to set this up. But the idea, the concept behind this is really powerful, because reverb is one of the biggest tools that we have outside of volume of telling distance between things, because it's a natural inclination of when I'm inside of a room, I can tell where something is at, whether it's close or far away to me, not only because of the volume and the brightness of that sound, but also the way it reflects around the room. So we can essentially adjust these various parameters that create depth inside of a mix to both create glue inside of the mix and cohesion inside of the mix, because we're using the same exact room reverb in these 3 spaces, the front, middle, and back. So not only does it feel like everything's in the same room, we can adjust those individual parameters to be able to create something that feels close to us versus something that feels far away. And so one of the biggest myths that I hear and see of people just really getting wrong with reverb is that the tail does not equal distance. So the tail of the reverb, so how long the reverb is, or reverb decay, is not the same as how far away that element is. One of the core things that took me so long to figure out, and I'm really sad that I didn't figure this out earlier. In order to use reverb effectively, we need to know the 3 parts of reverb that create distance inside of a track. And again, there's a more detailed video down below if you want to check that out. But the quick explanation is that there are 3 parts that create depth inside of a reverb comparatively to the direct signal that create depth. And so it's going to be the pre-delay, it's going to be the early late reflection balance, and it's going to be the balance between the direct sound and the reverb itself. What do I mean by those? So the pre-delay is really just the distance between when you hear the direct sound versus when you hear the first reflections. And so if I'm close to you, if I'm say an inch away from you and I tell you something, you're going to hear the direct sound right away. It's only an inch away, so you're going to basically hear it immediately. But the early reflection is going to be that first reflection of a wall, a ceiling, a floor, etc. So that's going to take a minute because that has to travel from my mouth to the floor and then back up to your ear before you actually hear that first reverb reflection from my voice. So that is pre-delay. The longer that pre-delay is, closer that will appear to be. So the longer the pre-delay, the closer it is. Again, there's more videos down below if you want to get a more detailed explanation of that. The second way to create depth with reverb is through the early late reflection balance. So the early reflections is basically what I was talking about with the first reflections, right? So you can almost say the early reflections is the first reflections. And those are the first most distinct reflections that you'll hear in reverb are going to be louder than the late reflections if something is close to us. So essentially we have a stair step. So the direct sound is really loud. The early reflections is the next loudest, and then the late reflections are really, really quiet. Then the last way to create depth with our reverb is the overall change between the direct sound and the reverb as a whole. So both the early and late reflections combined. So the further away something is, really the more of those late reflections you hear, which is why people think oftentimes that a longer tail will make something feel further away. And that is because you inherently are adding more late reflections to the sound. By utilizing these 3 tools of depth inside of reverb, we can then create compelling depth with these 3 spaces. We can use the same room, again, creating cohesion in the mix, but yet still creating separation because we have these front, middle, and back spaces that then are even stretched just a little bit more inside of our mix. And I used to teach this as a kind of a standalone concept, as you'll see below. But the problem with viewing this as a standalone concept is that it's only one of the 4 levers that we can use inside of our mix to create depth. Or really 5. Let's just say it's 5. It's only one of the 5 levers. And so it's powerful, but it's lacking some of its potential by including these other steps that I've already talked about. And the next step, which is phase 5, which is effects inside of your mix. When I was talking earlier about there may be no items in the back of your mix, this is where we can fix that. So effects are really, really powerful to create this feeling and sense of depth inside of our mix by creating elements that don't already exist in the mix to then create that contrast for us. Remember that contrast is the key to create distance in the mix or depth in the mix because we have something that's up front, we need something behind it. Be able to contrast that to make it feel bigger than it really is. One of the easiest examples that I can give you is if we have a very basic mix. Let's say we have an acoustic guitar and a vocal, and that's it. That's all the items in our mix. We have our vocal, which is probably the main thing, and our acoustic guitar, which is probably the second thing. And so we have both of those. Maybe the vocal is in the front space, maybe the guitar's in the middle space, but there's really not that much contrast between them, right? There's not very much depth. And so what we can do is we can create a sense of depth by creating another element inside the mix. Let's just say I create a slapback delay on my vocal. This is my favorite vocal technique to do because it creates this sense of depth with the vocal itself, and it creates this sense of wetness to the vocal without actually sacrificing the vocal's place in the mix, which is up front. Because oftentimes I will hear somebody who wants to add reverb to their vocal because they're like, oh, I love reverb on vocals. And then they put it directly on the vocal. And what that does is push the vocal back inside of the mix because these 2 things are so related, right? The reverb and then the vocal, that then it just makes it feel further away. Even if it's loud, it still feels further away. To combat this, what I like to do is do a slapback delay. So this is adding about 100 milliseconds or so delay from the vocal before we add more stuff to it. So we have the vocal, it goes to a bus that has that slapback delay on it. So it's delayed by about 100 milliseconds. I often offset that a little bit between the right and left channel to create some stereo width from the vocal, especially if I only have one vocal track. And this will both thicken up the main vocal, but also separate any effects that we use on that from the main vocal. So now I can add my compression. So I add some thickness compression to be able to make it feel a little slightly further away. I use some EQ to darken it a little bit. So again, it feels even from more far away. And then we also use volume, right? So this slapback delay is going to be really quiet, almost imperceptible in the mix because I want it to feel far away as possible. Last, I'm also going to add some reverb to it, and then I'm going to intend to add some reverb that feels far away. With all of those things combined, right, all of a sudden this effect feels like 100 feet away, right? It's way back there. And it creates that contrast with the main vocal. And the key distinction is that because we have this 100 millisecond delay between the main direct sound and the actual effects that we've been adding to it, is it separates them, because we don't ever hear early reflections, or we don't hear any pre-delay. You don't really hear pre-delay, you hear the reflections. Anyway, there are no pre-delays that are really longer than 50 milliseconds in real life. Well, technically they exist. We don't associate the direct sound and the reflection. So by separating it by 100 milliseconds, we've completely separated the direct sound from that effect, and we don't relate the two, so it doesn't push the main vocal back, which is super powerful. But we still get that contrast. And so in our scenario that we outlined, we now have a vocal, then we have our guitar in the middle space, our acoustic guitar, and then we have this really subtle reverb delay that feels really far away that then creates that contrast for the mix. And it creates this depth even where no depth existed. This also is a really powerful technique if you're mixing a pop punk track. Most of the elements of pop punk are very simple. There's not very many elements, and so they tend to all feel really close, and they all have to be loud in the mix to be able to create a compelling pop punk mix. You can create the front and middle spaces, but the back space is really difficult if you're not given much to choose from inside of the mix. And so by using these effects, so I'm going to add some, delay to my lead guitar, probably my vocal, even the snare, potentially adding some reverb there. And we can create this backdrop of just reverb and delay and other effects to be able to then create this feeling of depth in the mix, even when there wasn't any elements to belong in that space to begin with. We've created elements using effects to then have depth inside of our mix. Okay, the main thing I want you to take away from this is keeping this front, middle, back space in mind throughout the entire mixing process is one of the most powerful things you can do to create depth inside of your mix. And if you only use one of these, then you're likely not going to have a very compelling depth inside of your mix. There's lots of resources down below if you want to access those to learn more about any one of these concepts, but let me know your comments down below. Was this helpful? Was it not? Should I keep making these? Should I not? And I look forward to reading all of those. Then you're probably already producing and mixing your own music. And if you're unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively, or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes, and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So if this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside.